Behind the cold steel bars, among the ruthless and the condemned, the rules of survival are harsh and brutal. Kill or be killed. For some, the end of the road is not a gavel sentence, but the bloody hands of their fellow inmates. These are the dangerous killers who, despite their own heinous crimes, found themselves hunted, cornered, and brutally destroyed, facing the same violent fate they once inflicted on others. From violent attacks to calculated murders, here are 15 dangerous killers who met a violent end in unexpected ways while in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous Milwaukee cannibal, known for his gruesome murders and cannibalism, is one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Over the course of 13 terrifying years, from 1978 to 1991, Dahmer unleashed a reign of terror that left the world shocked and horrified. His victims, mostly young men, were brutally murdered, their bodies desecrated in ways that defy comprehension. Dahmer's horrifying journey began shortly after his high school graduation in Bath Township, Ohio, when he committed his first murder in 1978. His victim, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, was lured to Dahmer's family home, where he was killed and dismembered. But it wasn't until 1991, when police raided his Milwaukee apartment, that the true horror of his crimes came to light. What they found defied comprehension: body parts stored in his refrigerator, a severed head, and graphic photos of his dismembered victims. Even the most hardened detectives were shocked. After his arrest and trial, Dahmer was sentenced to Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. Behind bars, he showed no remorse. Instead, he became infamous among inmates for his dark sense of humor, shaping his food to resemble severed limbs and using ketchup to mimic blood, taunting both guards and fellow prisoners with dead jokes about his crimes. But on November 28, 1994, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who had grown tired of Dahmer's crazy behavior, took matters into his own hands. The two were assigned to a cleaning detail in the prison gym, and when they were left alone, Scarver seized a 20-inch metal bar from the equipment. Without hesitation, he attacked Dahmer with unrelenting force. Scarver later recalled how Dahmer desperately tried to escape, but he blocked his way. By the time the guards arrived, Dahmer was lying on the floor, beaten beyond recognition. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Albert DalSalvo. Between 1962 and 1964, the Boston area was gripped by fear as a series of brutal murders shook the city. The killer, who became known as the Boston Strangler, preyed on single women, ranging in age from 19 to 85. These women were attacked in the supposed safety of their own homes, spread across Boston and its suburbs. Despite many efforts by police, the murders remained unsolved until March 6, 1965, when a shocking confession came up. Albert DalSalvo, a convicted criminal from Massachusetts, took responsibility for all the killings. However, DalSalvo's confession wasn't supported by physical evidence. In fact, he was never charged with the murders. Instead, in 1967, DalSalvo was sentenced to life in prison for a series of unrelated sexual assaults. The murders of 13 women who were sexually assaulted and strangled with ropes, stockings, or cords remained officially unsolved. In 1967, after being sentenced to life, he escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital along with 2 other inmates, leaving behind a note claiming he wanted to expose poor prison conditions and his mental health struggles. A massive manhunt followed, but DalSalvo eventually surrendered after 3 days. He was transferred to Walpole Maximum Security Prison, where he paid the ultimate price. On November 25, 1973, Albert DalSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Robert Wilson, a man linked to the notorious Winter Hill Gang, was charged with the crime. Yet the trial ended in a hung jury, and Wilson walked free. It was later revealed that DalSalvo's death was connected to his involvement in a dangerous prison drug trade. Selling amphetamines at lower prices than the prison's syndicate allowed, DalSalvo had crossed a deadly line, one that led to his violent end. Though justice finally caught up with Albert DalSalvo after decades, the Boston Strangler's reign of terror continues to haunt the city's history. Whitey Bulger. As the city's most notorious crime boss, Whitey Bulger ruled the streets with an iron fist, orchestrating a reign of terror that lasted decades. He was feared, powerful, and utterly ruthless. But beneath his criminal empire lies a shocking betrayal. For years, Bulger had been a secret informant for the FBI, trading the lives of his closest allies for his own protection. After being sentenced to life in prison for his involvement in 11 brutal murders, Whitey Bulger was already 89 years old when he met his own violent end. In October 2018, just hours after being transferred to Hazleton Penitentiary in West Virginia, Bulger was dead. Despite his frail state and wheelchair confinement, no mercy awaited him inside those prison walls. 2 inmates wheeled him into a blind spot, out of sight from the guards and surveillance cameras. Armed with a sock stuffed with a heavy padlock, they delivered a savage beating that left Bulger unrecognizable. The attack was so brutal that it dislodged his eyeballs, a shocking symbol of the ferocity of his end. The suspected attacker, Fotios Freddy Gias, a former mafia hitman, had his own score to settle. Gias was serving a life sentence for his involvement in the slaying of a Genovese crime family boss. For some, Bulger's demise was a big sign of justice. Somehow, he couldn't escape the hand of justice. John Gigan, a Boston priest whose career spanned 30 years across Massachusetts. He was also a serial child rapist who would meet a grisly death in jail. Throughout his time as a priest, a web of corruption and complicity allowed Paul Gigan to prey on vulnerable victims, as higher-ups in the church turned a blind eye to his continuous stream of sexual abuse. Instead of facing justice, he was shuffled from parish to parish, leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. In 1991, the law finally caught up with him when he was prosecuted on molestation charges. Gigan was sentenced to prison in 2002 for an incident in which he molested a 10-year-old boy in a swimming pool. Meanwhile, another convicted murderer, Joseph Druce, was sentenced to life in prison in 1988 after killing a man who had picked him up while hitchhiking and allegedly made a sexual advance toward him. His life had already been marred by tragedy, having been a victim of child molestation. He was placed in the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Shirley, Massachusetts, a prison that would soon become the backdrop for an even darker chapter in his story. When Paul Gigan was convicted of horrific sexual crimes, he was sent to the same facility, placed in a protective custody unit alongside 23 other inmates. Little did Gigan know that his fate was sealed by the very prison walls meant to keep him safe. On a fateful day in August 2003, Druce entered Gigan's cell after lunch. With cold determination, he jammed the door shut, trapping Gigan inside. He bound and gagged the notorious priest, then tightened a bedsheet around his throat, slowly choking the life out of him. Druce then leaped from the bed onto Gigan's lifeless body, unleashing a savage beating with his bare hands. Only one officer was on duty at the time. When sounds of struggle was heard from Gigan's cell, he was forced to call for backup via walkie-talkie. It took multiple officers to pry the door open, and when they finally burst in, the scene was grim. It was clear Gigan wasn't going to wake up. Eventually, the medical examination ruled Gigan's cause of death as ligature strangulation and blunt chest trauma. Richard Lobe. Born into privilege, with his father a senior executive at Sears, Lobe was a child genius. By 14, he had already skipped several grades and was attending the University of Chicago. But behind his bright future, dark desires began to fester. By his teenage years, Lobe had turned to shoplifting, vandalism, and even arson, crimes that hinted at the dark path he was about to take. At the University of Chicago, he met Nathan Leopold, another intellectual prodigy. Together, they concocted dark fantasy committing the perfect crime. Luring 14-year-old Bobby Franks into their car, they brutally struck him with a chisel and attempted to hide his identity by burning his face with acid. They dumped his body in a lake, convinced they had left no trace, but a single mistake revealed their plan after a pair of distinctive eyeglasses belonging to Leopold was found at the crime scene. Lobe was arrested and faced his own brutal end. In 1936, while serving his sentence at Statesville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, He was viciously attacked by fellow inmate James Day, who claimed Lobe had made unwanted advances. The attack was savage, leaving Lobe with over 50 wounds. His life ended in violence, similar to the horrific crime he had committed. Pedro Alonzo Lopez. Known as the Monster of the Andes, Pedro is a convicted Colombian serial killer who is believed to have murdered more than 300 people. His life began in darkness, marked by homelessness, violence, and unspeakable abuse. His mother, a prostitute, unleashed a torrent of physical abuse on him while enduring her own torment at the hands of her clients. Lopez found himself in Bogotá, Colombia's capital, where he joined the ranks of the city's homeless children, known as gamines. In this unforgiving environment, he was drawn into a gang and became addicted to the use of bazuco, an impure form of cocaine. Having spent his childhood wandering the unforgiving streets, Pedro Alonzo Lopez was arrested at the age of 21 for stealing a car. While behind bars, he became a victim once again, this time sexually assaulted by at least 2 men who preyed on his vulnerability. Driven by rage and desperation, Lopez crafted a makeshift knife from whatever he could find. In an act of vengeance, he turned the tables on his attackers, brutally ending their lives in a violent struggle for survival. Upon his release from prison, Pedro Alonzo Lopez vanished into the shadows, where his monstrous urges reawakened. He started targeting vulnerable young girls, often indigenous and struggling to survive. He became a predator, luring his unsuspecting victims to desolate areas where he unleashed unspeakable horrors during the mid to late 1970s. Lopez's murder spree continued unabated, and by the late 1970s, he had crossed into Ecuador, where an alarming number of girls began to vanish without a trace. He was eventually caught, and by the time authorities intervened, they unearthed a graveyard of 57 bodies. Coupled with Lopez's confessions, he was charged with a staggering 110 murders. On July 31, 1981, the 33-year-old Lopez pleaded guilty to the murders of 57 girls and was incarcerated in Ambato, where he was diagnosed as a sociopath. After his release, the man vanished without a trace even to this day. Raymond Morris. He was described as cold, cruel, and just plain wicked. The notorious child killer Raymond Morris, popularly known as the Cannock Chase murderer, is a sadistic monster who was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the horrific 1967 rape and murder of 7-year-old Christine Darby from Walsall. Justice finally caught up with Morris at the Staffordshire Assizes, where he was convicted of the horrific murder and rape of young Christine Darby. He was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, his existence was marked by shadows. Denied parole in 1999, Morris became one of Britain's oldest-serving prisoners, living a solitary and largely forgotten life in HMP Weymouth, a dark fate for a man whose crimes haunted a nation. During his years in prison, Morris experienced some of the most inhumane activities ever. Years later, the child murderer died a peaceful and painless death despite his final years being crippled with leukemia and kidney failure. Ian Brady. One of the most infamous cases in British criminal history. 2 young lovers kidnap, sexually assault, and murder children before burying them on the moors. Ian Brady lured a young kid to a place where she was sexually assaulted and her throat cut twice. Her body was buried on the moor but not found until 1987 when the pair finally confessed. Brady said his girlfriend, Hindley, had participated in the sexual abuse, but she claimed she waited in the car until Brady came to show her the teenager's body. At the age of 28, Ian Brady was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences for the brutal murders of Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. Myra Hindley received 2 life sentences, along with an additional 7 years for her role as an accessory in Kilbride's death. Miraculously, they narrowly escaped the noose, as the death penalty had been abolished just a year earlier in 1965. It wasn't until 1985 that Brady finally broke his silence, confessing to the shocking murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. As a high-profile criminal responsible for heinous crimes, Brady was widely recognized by other inmates. This notoriety often made him a target for hostility. To reduce the risk of violence from other inmates, Brady spent much of his time in protective custody. This meant he was isolated from the general prison population to prevent attacks and ensure his safety. There were reports of threats made against him, and at times, he was the target of physical assaults. However, due to the nature of his crimes, he was often segregated from the general population to avoid confrontations. Brady's later years were marked by a dark hunger strike, leading to force-feeding at Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital, where he continued to defy humanity until his death in 2017. Meanwhile, there is a possibility that his death is somehow related to the ill treatment he received while serving time. Frank Cohen, a self-proclaimed Nazi leader, Cohen became notorious for his efforts to promote hate in the United States during the 1970s. Cohen led the National Socialist Party of America, a group that espoused the same twisted ideologies as the Third Reich. With an unrelenting passion for spreading his vile beliefs, he planned a march in the heart of Skokie, Illinois, a community home to many Holocaust survivors. This calculated act of provocation started fierce debates over free speech versus hate speech. As the situation blew out of proportion, Cohen's past began to unravel. It was revealed that he had a secret. He was not who he claimed to be. Frank Cohen, the face of American Nazism, was actually Frank Cohen, the son of Jewish immigrants. In 1978, Cohen faced legal troubles that turned into his arrest. His act had finally caught up with him, and he was charged with multiple offenses, including disorderly conduct. After years of hellish life with hardcore inmates, Cohen's life became increasingly isolated. He vanished into obscurity, consumed by the very darkness he had once sought to exploit. On a fateful day in 1992, Frank Cohen's life came to a tragic conclusion. He was found in a nursing home, dead. T.J. Lane. A troubled kid by many accounts, his rampage left the small town of Chardon, Ohio, forever scarred. Despite growing up in what seemed like an all-American Midwest town, Lane's life was anything but normal. His father, Thomas Lane Jr., spent years in and out of prison for violent crimes against women, including Lane's mother, who herself was arrested for domestic violence. One morning, Lane targeted 5 male students and 1 female, shooting them without hesitation. He fled the scene, but he was tackled by a brave teacher, after which he was arrested and thrown into prison. After many unruly behavior, the prison officials stripped him of his recreation privileges, leaving him isolated for 7 days. Lane's inability to adapt to the harsh realities of prison life became very clear. For months, he had been confined to protective custody, but whether he was there during his escape remains a mystery. In July 2013, Lane was sentenced to 10 days in segregation for an unsettling charge: self-mutilation, including carving a tattoo into his own skin. Just a month later, he defied orders, refusing a work assignment, earning only a verbal reprimand. Eventually, Lane's defiance grew more stronger. He refused orders, this time losing 10 days of recreation. Lane's defiance wasn't just met with consequences from the prison staff. His fellow inmates delivered their own brutal punishments for at least 3 similar offenses. The most recent was triggered by after he urinated on the prison wall. Larry Nassar. In the halls of a Florida federal penitentiary, a violent attack unfolded. Disgraced former sports doctor Larry Nassar, infamous for his crimes against young athletes, was watching a Wimbledon tennis match on TV when he allegedly made a vile, lewd comment. That remark would spark a brutal retaliation. Shane McMillan, the inmate who launched the attack, was no stranger to violence. Convicted years earlier for assaulting a correctional officer and attempting to stab another inmate at a federal supermax prison, McMillan's reputation was steeped in blood. One morning, McMillan stormed into Nassar's cell, armed with a makeshift weapon. He stabbed Nassar repeatedly in the neck, chest, and back, leaving him bleeding on the floor. It took the desperate efforts of 4 other inmates to pull McMillan away from his target. Correctional officers responded quickly, performing life-saving measures as Nassar lay on the edge of death, suffering from injuries that included a collapsed lung. He was rushed to a hospital and remained in stable condition, clinging to life. It turned out that Nassar made disturbing comment about wanting to watch young girls play in the Wimbledon women's match. a remark that made the inmate to retaliate. Jack UnterWager, one of the most dangerous writers in history. Jack UnterWager was a convicted murderer who was once hailed as a literary genius after finding fame behind bars. Lauded as a reformed man, the public had no idea he was still hiding a monstrous secret. UnterWager had never stopped killing. His journey to Los Angeles would leave 3 more victims, 3 sex workers, brutally murdered. Their bodies were found beaten and strangled with their own bras, a chilling signature of UnterWager's crimes. This same man had already served time for the 1976 murder of 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer, found strangled in the woods, her bra tied in twisted knots. But that wasn't the end. While serving his life sentence, UnterWager learned the world's fascination with true crime and turned it to his advantage, becoming a celebrated author. From Austria to Czechoslovakia, the bodies of sex workers began to pile up. 7 victims in Austria alone, all strangled, all with their undergarments. UnterWager's reign of terror ended in 1994 after a trial that revealed all of his crimes. Convicted of murdering 9 women, he became the most notorious killer in Austrian history. But his double life ended by his own hand, hanging himself in his prison cell, using a drawstring from his pants. As a result of frustration of prison life and inmates, the killer who had once fooled the world met a fitting end, leaving behind a trail of death and deception. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, a very notorious criminal with dark past, found himself in yet another criminal incident, but this time it was with an inmate. The notorious mass murderer was hired to exact deadly revenge on Dmer, who was already awaiting execution for the brutal double murder of a South Carolina couple. Inside the high-security confines of Cell Block 2 at Columbia's Central Correctional Institution, Dmer's fate was sealed in a horrifying act of deception. While sitting on a toilet, Dmer held a booby-trapped cup to his ear, thinking it was a makeshift radio. In an instant, the cup exploded, killing him on the spot. His so-called friend Gaskin had orchestrated the gruesome assassination, using an explosive device to carry out the job from within the prison walls. Gaskin eventually confessed to 15 murders, victims that included a man who owed him money, a wealthy farmer, a pregnant woman and her toddler, a runaway girl, and even his own 15-year-old niece. On that dark day 40 years ago, Gaskin claimed his final victim in a ruthless display of power and cruelty.